Next up, we have another episode from Eusebius in his work Church History, Book 5, Chapter 24. It's a rather long chapter, so for the sake of time, I won't quote the entirety of it. For context, in chapter 23, Eusebius writes about how there was a discrepancy across the churches regarding when Easter was celebrated, whether it ought to be the 14th of the month of Nisan, whatever day of the week it may fall upon, or the Lord's Day, meaning Sunday, in commemoration of Christ's resurrection. Synods and assemblies were held, and the councils unanimously gave the verdict that the church ought to celebrate on the Lord's Day. Hence, today we have Easter Sunday. Now we come to chapter 24. In section 1, we read, quote, "But the bishops of Asia, led by Polycrates, decided to hold to the old custom handed down to them. Polycrates writes a letter to Victor and the Church of Rome announcing his rejection of the council's decision regarding the celebration of Easter, detailing his reasons for holding an alternative opinion. Namely, he cites various saints, calling them, quote, great lights, which, quote, have fallen asleep and will rise again on the day of the Lord's coming. Namely, Philip, one of the 12, 3 of his daughters, John the beloved disciples, Polycarp, and various others, saying, quote, all these observe the 14th day of the Passover according to the gospel, deviating in no respect, but following the rule of faith, which I also, Polycrates, the least of you all, do according to the tradition of my relatives, some of whom I have closely followed. For 7 of my relatives were bishops, and I am the 8th. And my relatives have observed the day when the people put away the leaven. He also makes mention of those other bishops who were present with him at the time of writing and of the same opinion, and thus he closes the letter to Victor. In section 9 of chapter 24, book 5, we read, quote, thereupon Victor, who presided over the church at Rome, immediately attempted to cut off from the communion unity the parishes of all Asia, with the churches that agreed with them, as heterodox, and he wrote letters and declared all the brethren there wholly excommunicate. Now, before we continue, it's important to note 2 things. Firstly, the very fact that Polycrates wrote to Victor specifically ought to catch our attention. If the Bishop of Rome were merely just another bishop with happenstance relative prominence due to economic or otherwise external non-spiritual conditions, then why would Polycrates not simply address the letter to the various synods and assemblies which met regarding the issue? In chapter 23, section 2, we read, quote, there is still extant a writing of those who were then assembled in Palestine, over whom Theophilus, bishop of Caesarea, and Narcissus, bishop of Jerusalem, presided. And there's also another writing extant of those who were assembled at Rome to consider the same question, which bears the name of Bishop Victor, also of the bishops in Pontus, over whom Palmus, the oldest, presided, and of the parishes in Gaul, of which Irenaeus was bishop, and of those in Osroene and the cities there, and a personal letter of Baculus, bishop of the church at Corinth, and of a great many others who uttered the same opinion and judgment and cast the same vote. So Victor was hardly the only prominent figure presiding over these councils, and if the Bishop of Rome does not have some special precedence over the church as a whole, it doesn't outright make sense as to why Polycrates would single him out. This fact alone should give us pause. Secondly, it's important to note that while the issue of which day is proper upon which to celebrate Easter on was decided by council, as soon as Polycrates disputes the council's verdict in his letter to Victor, Victor immediately writes letters declaring them excommunicated. While this section doesn't explicitly say, and Victor did this by citing his unique authority over the church as Peter's successor, there's also no mention of him grounding his decision in the council's or synod's authority. Combined with the fact that Polycrates addresses his letter to Victor specifically, this paints the picture that Polycrates seems to view Victor as a principled head of the decision regarding Easter, and perhaps as the one who might be able to grant a dispensation for the churches in Asia due to the historicity of the proposed alternative practice. I would argue that even thus far, we have strong evidence for an affirmative verdict, but let's move ahead to the main issue of chapter 24. Immediately following section 9, where Victor wrote letters declaring the Asian churches to be excommunicated, in section 10 we read, quote, but this did not please all the bishops, and they besought him to consider the things of peace and of neighborly unity and love. Words of theirs are extant, sharply rebuking Victor. And in section 11, quote, among them was Irenaeus, who, sending letters in the name of the brethren in Gaul, over whom he presided, maintained that the mystery of the resurrection of the Lord should be observed only on the Lord's day. He fittingly admonishes Victor that he should not cut off whole churches of God, which observe the tradition of an ancient custom, and after many other words he proceeds as follows. Sections 12 through 17 contain excerpts from Irenaeus' letter to Victor, where he affirms the importance of Easter being on Sunday as opposed to the 14th of the month of Nisan, but he points out that the issue or question of when is the proper day to celebrate Easter predates them back to the time of the apostles, immediate successors, namely Polycarp, saying he had disagreed with Anicetus, who was Bishop of Rome at the time, over the issue, yet they had resolved not to quarrel about it and they had parted in peace. His main point being that yes, the issue is important, yet nowhere in the church's history has this been an issue worth excommunication. And even when prominent figures held differing views, it never escalated beyond an amicable disagreement. Section 18 concludes chapter 24 with the following, quote, thus Irenaeus, who truly was well named, became a peacemaker in this matter, exhorting and negotiating in this way in behalf of the peace of the churches. And he conferred by letter about this mooted question, not only with Victor, but also with most of the other rulers of the churches. Now, some may say that this episode in church history provides the early seeds of papal overreach, of an overly ambitious bishop of Rome attempting to seize power that the other bishops rejected. Proponents of this view point to the bishop's rebuke of Victor as proof they didn't see him as a universal authority over the church. But notice the nature of the rebuke. Eusebius does not narrate Victor as doing something laughably irrelevant or jurisdictionally meaningless. He presents it as a grave ecclesial crisis. Victor tried to sever, quote, the parishes of all Asia from, quote, the common unity, and the rest of the bishops reacted because the move had real consequences for communion. Also, notice the nature of Irenaeus' objection. It's not that Victor doesn't have the legitimate authority to do this, but rather the main thrust of his argument is that the issue at hand isn't worthy of the punishment he is attempting to enact. In other words, the dispute as recorded by Eusebius is over the use of Roman power, not over whether Rome's action had ecclesial weight at all. It is rather telling that St. Irenaeus, perhaps the most prominent bishop in the West at the time, did not respond to Pope Victor by telling him he had no right to intervene in the East. Instead, he appeals to Victor's mercy and sense of peace. In any other context, we recognize this dynamic. You don't beg a peer for mercy, you appeal to a superior for moderation. Imagine at work, one of your coworkers makes a small but costly mistake, and when he hears of it, your boss threatens to fire them. You and some other coworkers who witnessed the whole thing meet with your boss in a private meeting and make the case in favor of your unfortunate coworker, saying things like, hey, mistakes happen. It could have happened to any of us. I recognize this cost the company money, but I don't think it's quite a fireable offense. And after talking for a bit, your boss cools down and changes his mind. Notice how the sequence of events and tone of this made-up scenario maps neatly onto what we read in Eusebius' writings. The very fact that the entire Christian world was in an uproar over Victor's decree proves that the global church acknowledged his word had the structural power to sever communion on a massive scale. This means they weren't fighting over whether he had the keys, they were fighting over how he used them. So while this episode in church history doesn't by itself prove the papacy outright, it does show the Bishop of Rome acting as though he could affect communion beyond his local church, and it shows the wider church treating that move as consequential enough to require urgent resistance and mediation. And that serves our purpose for the second litmus test, the question of authority. Do we see Rome acting beyond its local church to arbitrate disputes or discipline with real weight? According to 1 Clement, yes. According to Dionysius of Corinth, yes. According to Eusebius, Victor, and Irenaeus, yes.